بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله تعالى وسلم على سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. I couldn't help but smile when you said that we all had 10 minutes each, because I was thinking sheikhs and 10-minute speeches. That's a difficult one, but I'll try inshallah. What I would like to do is try to, go back to how sometimes an issue that arises among Muslims, how back in the day our scholars would frame them based on a set of principles followed by specific references from the Quran and the Sunnah, both being our ultimate sources of inspiration for what we do. And those principles are important because they provide a simple narrative, a simple set of ideas that we can always refer back to when we start to deviate from the path. One of the things that recently has been bugging me is when I look at the struggle of Muslims in trying to apply what they understand as a set of universal values that they've learned from Islam into an environment that is significantly different to the sources from which they take those values. So when they read the Quran, when they read the Sunnah, when they read the statements of the ulama all the way up to the 20th century, the environment within which those values had originally been applied seems very different to this environment. And I think there is an ongoing challenge for Muslims as to how they come to terms with not what Islam in the modern society might look like, but really what an Islamic lifestyle might look like. I think there's a difference between the two, because one can appear very bookish, very black and white, very something that lacks fluidity, whereas that is not how we see lifestyle. A way of life is much more fluid. It's able to take things into its stride and so forth. And I think matters of the environment have suffered from this problem, in the sense that Muslims had lived in circumstances where their lifestyle dealt with issues of the environment in this fluid and organic manner, but we no longer exist in such circumstances and have simply not been able to adapt. And therefore, when you speak, particularly if you speak to my father about the environment, he'll think, what's the big deal, right? Haven't I taught you to save water when you make wudu, right? Haven't I taught you not to waste water when you make a shower? And when we have had our circles in the evening, as children, my father used to do that, did we not go through all of the teachings about the Prophet ﷺ with regards to israf and so forth? And we did, we applied those things in our wudu and so on and so forth. But then modern life is about much more than wudu and taking a shower and so on, right? There are cars and fumes and there's pollution and so on and so forth, which really, our texts don't deal with. So I think these are things that we're trying to tackle. I would say that the whole discussion around the environment can be summed up with a few principles, right? A few usul, if you like. One of them is the idea of ni'mah, the idea of acknowledging what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted us as favors and understanding what that implies. So whenever we understand ni'mah in an Islamic context, what comes with it straight away is shukr, is gratitude. And I think it's important to ask ourselves whether we think our environment is a blessing of Allah or not, whether our environment is a ni'mah or not, and whether it being a ni'mah creates an imperative within us of a particular type of gratitude, a very specific kind of gratitude that is specific to the situation that we find ourselves in as far as the environment is concerned. And of course that imperative is very, very clearly stated in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that we will be accountable for all of the bounties that He has granted us. He says so in Surah Al-Takathur, where He says, ثُمَّ لَتُسْأَلُنَّ يَوْمَئِذٍ عَنِ النَّعِيمِ, that on the Day of Judgment you will surely, with emphasis, you will surely be questioned with regards to عَنِ النَّعِيمِ. And here the word na'im has the definite article which implies istighraq, which implies that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking here not just about some bounties, some favors and not others, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about all of them. So that is one. The second principle, or the second thing to learn, is Islam's teachings around israf, around wasting, around immoderation and moderation, the extent to which we have to live in moderation. The idea of the mizan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانِ, which of course is the same surah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeatedly tells us, فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. He asks us this question: how many of the bounties of Allah will you deny? And this surah begins, Surah Al-Rahman begins with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's statement that Allah raised the heavens, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا, He raised the heavens, وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانِ, and He established balance. أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ. And the idea of the balance, everything Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is about, and when He tells us about it, this is an important principle actually. We discuss it in theology, that why does Allah do things? And often it is to create, and why does He do things first, and then why does He tell us about that? So in this situation, when Allah tells us about the balance, and then telling us about the balance is creating an imperative within us that informs our action, informs our attitudes. And here Allah spells it out by saying, أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ, and do not transgress the balance. So this idea of moderation, of balance, and therefore not wasting and so forth. Of course we know that إِنَّ الْمُبَذِّرِينَ كَانُوا إِخْوَانَ الشَّيَاطِينَ, that indeed those who waste are the brothers of Satan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us this in the Quran. The third principle, an important one, and I think you touched on it, is the principle of zuhud, the principle of, loosely translated as asceticism, living a life not of materialism, living a life of disinterest in the dunya, understanding the nature of the dunya, which is a bit of a kind of contradiction, right? Because is it possible that we could misinterpret that and think that living a life where we are disinterested in the dunya somehow means that we are not concerned about the dunya, right? And the two are different. In fact, living a life of zuhud is living a life of moderation, living a life of wasting, so that we don't live a life where we waste because we love the dunya. And the opposite of zuhud is love of dunya, right? And حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَّةُ الْمَوْتِ, of course, is considered one of those major problems in people, a love of the dunya and a dislike of death, like a fear of death, fear of our mortality, and loving the dunya are considered the root of all evil. So this idea of zuhud ultimately makes us people who don't overconsume, and this is the key link with the environment. If you're a zahid, you don't have a ridiculous number of shoes. If you're a zahid, you don't have 3 cars instead of 1. If you're a zahid, you don't spend money where you don't need to. If you're a zahid, you are less interested in the trappings of wealth, more interested in the akhirah, more interested in serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more interested in how you can live. Again, this idea of a lifestyle that leads you, that doesn't entrench you in the dunya, but leads you towards the akhirah. And the 4th principle is the one that is being mentioned a lot, is our position as vicegerents on earth, as stewards on earth. And the idea of khulafa, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala articulates it in many different verses. In one verse He says, وَهُوَ الَّذِي جَعَلَكُمْ خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَرَفَعَ بَعْضَكُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِي مَا آتَاكُمْ. That He is the one who has made you stewards on the earth and has raised some of you in rank over others, so that in these situations, in your circumstance of stewardship and in your various kind of statuses which are a fact of life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can test you in everything that He has given you. And the interesting thing about this verse, if you read into it, then the verse implies what Allah has given you and what He hasn't given you. Because the verse talks about people naturally being different in wealth, in status. Some are poor, some are rich, some are born into wealth, some are not born into wealth, some are better looking than others, some are taller than others, some are stronger than others. Allah says, رَفَعَ بَعْضَكُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ. Some people are raised over others in degrees. Some are employer, others are employee. Right? So some are to be obeyed and others not. Others obey. So all of these things are the circumstances of our stewardship, and in all of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's objective is that we are to be tried in everything that He gives us. Everything that He gives us, both whether we perceive them to be positive or whether we perceive them to be negative. In all of those things, we are still stewards of Allah on earth. In another place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ لِنَنْظُرَ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ. To the Banu Israel, to the children of Israel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told them that we after Fir'aun, we made you stewards of the earth. We gave you power, not because you deserve it or because of any other reason, but ultimately he failed his test. Now it's your turn for your test, so that we can see how you conduct yourselves. There is no stake. Nobody from Allah, nobody deserves anything. Nobody deserves anything. Ultimately, it's all a test, and every aspect of it is accountable, and that's the key. Every aspect of this test is something for which we will be answered. And therefore, the environment is tied into the whole discourse around what is protected. The whole discourse around what is protected in Islam. In Islam, life is protected. The Prophet ﷺ told us that a person's dam, his blood, is protected. And connected with that is, of course, life, health, security. All of these things are critical to the idea of the sanctity of blood or the sanctity of life. And if the environment isn't protected, then ultimately that sanctity is lost. Disease increases. More people die when they shouldn't be dying. They die in circumstances. Yes, our understanding of destiny tells us that people die when they die, right? But there is a whole discourse around, well, yes, a person has died when they are to die, but did they need to die in squalor? Did they have to die in squalor? Could that have been avoided? Right? So there are still things. And then we know, of course, that our understanding of destiny does not make us fatalists, right? So that even if the day of judgment is before us, the hadith tells us that even if a person sees that the major signs of Qiyamah are right in front of him, and he knows that this is it, this is the end, and he is about to plant a tree or a vegetable or whatever it is, he's about to place there in his hand, and he sees that the day of judgment is here, the end of time is here. Does he decide, well, it's not worth it? The Prophet ﷺ says, you know what, if he is in that situation and the end of time is right in front of him, he's absolutely certain that it is here, he still has to plant that tree. He still has to plant that tree. So we are not fatalists. Qadr doesn't in any way inform our action. Right? This is very, very important. Anyway, so some of I've had a look at some of the material produced by Made, and if you want verses and ahadith and so on and so forth, there's lots of them. But I think what's important to understand that the whole notion of environment and protecting the environment and so on and so forth is something that the Islamic lifestyle did organically, in a very in a preventative way. It was done. I think if Islam had the power that it had 500 years ago, nuclear bombs wouldn't be produced, right? No, it just wouldn't be allowed, right? Certain types of weaponry would be forbidden. At the stage of invention, they would be forbidden. They just wouldn't be allowed because they are completely un-Islamic, right? Because they go against the principles taught by the Prophet ﷺ. If the Prophet ﷺ in war told his companions that don't kill women, don't kill children, don't kill the elderly, don't destroy date palms, don't uproot any trees, and do not demolish any homes, do you think that his teachings would endorse bombs that indiscriminately would do all of that at the click of a button? So there is a completely different ethical framework that to a certain extent we've lost because we don't know how that framework can be applied. And I think this is where Made and organizations such as these come in. I would say that their work, that this kind of work is a fard kifaya that everybody has to get behind, right? So there are some people who are fulfilling the kifaya, who are fulfilling the role of leading the initiative, and there is a religious duty upon everybody else to do what they can to support it. Otherwise, if the kifaya, meaning if sufficiency isn't achieved insofar as the contribution of Muslims towards these objectives, then as you know the rule with regards to fard kifaya, everybody is accountable for it. So if there is no sufficiency, then every single person, Muslims in particular, every single Muslim, because you understand what I'm talking about when I say fard kifaya, every Muslim is accountable for that collective failure, right? I think this is something we have to understand. I think the objective of my 10 minutes should be that this isn't about being a bit hip, doing something different, being a bit stylish, a different crowd, things like that. It isn't about that. It is about very, very clear, very, very concrete religious imperative for which there is absolutely no doubt in my mind we will be answerable on the Day of Judgment. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum.